Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Nats Chat. I'm Kari Ragan, the moderator and host of Nats Chats, and I'm so pleased you are here to join us tonight to discuss this important topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have to first begin by thanking Inside View Press for their continued sponsorship of Nats Chats. And I would like to also thank, of course, Alan Henderson for agreeing to co-host tonight's Nats Chat with me. My esteemed guests tonight are Lily Guerrero, Nathan Deshawn Myers, and Albert Lee. So thank you, the three of you, for joining us. Before we launch into our chat, I want to mention a recent article that's titled Practicing Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging in the Singing Voice Studio. And it is written by Elizabeth Ann Benson, Trinice Robinson Martin, and Marissa Lee Naismith. And it can be found in Voice and Speech Review from 2021. And it is a tremendous contribution to this important conversation. So if you can get your hands on that article, I encourage you to do so. So let's start a little bit around the nomenclature of what we at NATS use DEI. And Albert, would you like to begin?
Sure. I'll start by just saying in the landscape of what I will call DEIB, because it's currently what I'm using in my new institution and new position, that these words point us to something. And I think it is sometimes challenging because what a word means to me and what a word means to somebody else is going to differ. But when we can sort of come together around shared understanding of these terminologies, I think we put ourselves in a better position to have discussions that are impactful and that actually begin to move the needle as we stand up more inclusive voice studios where belonging is at the center of the work we do and equity is the lens that we move from. Diversity is probably the easiest of the words. The presence of difference is all around us all the time. We can qualify those differences and quantify those differences in all sorts of different ways. Diversity is the easy part. I would say that the equity piece is the hard part, and the inclusion piece has to go beyond just making sure that voices are heard, but that the message of the voice gets included into the policy and gets centered into the policy. And so where we get into trouble is the equity and inclusion piece.
Thank you, Albert. And let me regroup just a little. That's such a great introduction to this conversation. Thank you. Albert, would you introduce yourselves to us a little bit?
Sure. I'm Albert Lee. I am originally from New Haven, Connecticut. I have just moved back to New Haven, Connecticut. I'm Associate Professor of Music at Yale University School of Music and the inaugural Director of Equity, Belonging, and Student Life here. The last 9 years, I was on faculty and head of the voice area at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Nathan, would you tell us a bit about where you are and who you are?
Yes, my name is Nathan Deshawn Myers. I'm assistant professor of voice, and I actually am also on the choral conducting faculty at Arizona State University. I also share the responsibility of co-chairing the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. It's a standing committee at the university in the School of Music, Dance, and Theater. And so I've kind of joined in with lots of local organizations here to kind of help them, reframe the way that they build their policies and how they look at these concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Nathan. Lily, would you please introduce yourselves to us?
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Lily Guerrero. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Director of Vocal Studies and Assistant Professor of Voice at Texas Lutheran University in Seguin, Texas. We are an HSI, which means a Hispanic Serving Institution. A university gets that designation if a majority of their students are Hispanic or Latinx identifying. And so 70% of my students are either BIPOC or first gen. And I also teach a little bit in the Women and Gender Studies department, and I'm the advisor for the Mariachi Ensemble on campus. In addition to the work that I do at the university, I am a Future of Music Faculty Fellow through the Cleveland Institute of Music. And that's an inaugural program that just started this year. There are 40 music faculties members across the country in various eras of music study that gather every month and discuss DEI issues in the college music setting. And then I'm also a member of the NAT's Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Task Force, and I'm an art song advisor for the Institute for Composer Diversity.
Thank you. And Lily, I don't think you mentioned, you have a special certification around this topic. Am I correctly remembering that?
Yes, that's correct. So while I do hold a doctorate in voice performance from Florida State University, I also have certification in diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. So that's definitely my secondary passion in regards to music and how that can intersect.
And I got to see that in action this summer at the intern program. So I learned a great deal from Lily. So thank you for that. And Lily, did you want to talk just a moment about nomenclature, specifically in your area of interest?
Sure. So I can only speak from the lived experience that I hold as a Latina. My parents are immigrants. My dad is from Mexico. He was undocumented the first 18 years of my life. And then my mom is a political refugee from Cuba. So a lot of the time in Hispanic or Latinx circles, there's an argument as to what should we call ourselves? What should the language or nomenclature be around how we identify? Because we're such a varied group of people, and Hispanic or Latinx is not a race. It is an ethnicity. So Hispanic people come in every color, they speak multiple languages. And so there's this specific designation when you are discussing this particular population of people, whereas Hispanic refers to anyone who speaks Spanish. So it's a language dominant. So that includes Spain, but it excludes places like Brazil and parts of the Caribbean. Whereas Latinx is more geographical, so we're talking about Central, South America, and the Caribbean, so that it does include non-Spanish speakers, such as people in Haiti and Brazil, and so that's much more about geography. And so depending on who you speak to, some people don't like the word Hispanic because it is a colonizer designation. We didn't start using that term in the United States until the 70s when we needed to have a designation for this large group of people. So the census came up with the word Hispanic, and it also rubs some people the wrong way just because it again prioritizes the history of how we got here through colonization instead of celebrating the more indigenous aspects of people who are raised as Hispanic or Latinx. And then within the word Latinx specifically, some people don't like putting the X at the end of the word because, again, it somewhat bastardizes the Spanish language. Because we are a Romance language, is there anything wrong with ending things in O or A like we do in Italian and other languages? But the reason why we use the X is to identify that there are people who identify as Latinx who are not strictly putting themselves on this gender binary of male or female. So they don't want to be identified as Latino or Latina. So that we use Latinx as a gender neutral designation. The other one that has been becoming more popular through the years is Latine with an E, signaling the plural form of the word. Again, some people don't like that because it insinuates a lot of the time Latinx, Latine, or Latino-a with an ampersand, so it's A and O at the same time. You'll see that as well. Really the only people that use that language are academics and people who have had the access to education, especially here in the United States. And so sometimes marginalized people within Hispanic or Latinx culture don't like those designations because it insinuates a sort of elitism or superiority, or I guess inaccessibility to academia for people who don't feel like they follow the Latinx designation and they would prefer to just keep it the traditional Latino or Latina. So all that to say is ask someone or let them tell you first what they prefer, because 99% of the time they will understand that there's a difference between your intent and your impact. And if they can sense that your intent is good and that you just want to understand and honor their heritage, they're not going to be upset if you mess up a little bit. But do ask what it is that they would prefer, because everybody is different.
Thank you. That was, yes, Albert.
Just wanted to interject. Lily, thank you for that. That was amazing. I feel like I just learned something and clarified a few things that I already knew. I think this opens up the possibility of a wonderful discussion about how we actually apply this in the studio and in our interactions with people. And I think Lily brings up a perfect point, which is letting other people, letting the person that you're working with dictate how they want to be identified. I want to go a step further than that, because we also have to recognize the ways in which a centuries-long culture of centered identities being pinnacle and being, the ultimate and the supreme. You will have students who it seems that they would identify with a non-white group or a non-gender binary group, and you will want to make an assumption about it, and you may even ask them how they want to be identified, and they won't be able to tell you because it's not something that they themselves have explored. And so the student-teacher relationship in the voice studio is such that we have to work with extreme care at molding and developing not just a voice, but developing a human being who has myriad identities that they themselves may not understand and that will keep evolving. And we have to come up with a language and a way to discuss, and a way to an openness and an honesty that gives room for the malleability of identity as we all grow. Just a word of caution about grouping people. There, in the same way that there are concerns about terminology for people from Central and South America, as well as whether it be the term be about language or the term be about geography, there are people who find even the grouping of a term like BIPOC offensive because it just lumps everyone who's not white into one group, and it, in a sense, allows sort of groups dominated by majority to kind of pick and choose as they wish. And I think one of the wonderful things about what Lily shared with us about this difference between race and ethnicity, and this difference around gender, is that as we live in this society, all of these things intersect. And if we don't understand how they all intersect and how they leave certain people from certain groups of certain gender identities structurally in weaker positions because of the combination of things, we end up doing what works for us as the voice teacher or works for us as the power center, and not what actually creates a context where everyone can come to the table with their whole selves and learn, grow, and thrive.
Thank you, Albert. And I think to your point too, that when they're younger, they're still trying to come to themselves. So creating room for that is really important. I really love that. Thank you. Alan, I want to come to you for just a moment, since this is a NATS chat. And the NATS organization is working to make changes around DEI. And would you like to just talk a bit about that, how we as an organization are working?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. And I think all our panelists tonight have been engaged in some of the conversations we've been having within NATS and within the leadership of NATS about moving forward in a lot of different directions in the future. We began some conversations really about diversity, equity, inclusion when we began working on our strategic plan several years ago. And we're even already in some of those conversations and talking about how some of those issues have been longstanding within a lot of organizations, professional organizations, NATS included, and how we can create a better atmosphere and create a more inclusive environment for every member of NATS and all future members of NATS for that matter, and as well as facilitating the awareness among our students and in the conversations like we're having tonight. Part of that conversation led to our DEI Toolkit, which can be found on our website. And the best way to find it is just go to the search box and click on and type in DEI Toolkit, and you'll find it. But it's also on the About Us link when you in Connect menu on our new website, and it's right below the mission statement, the vision statement. And so that toolkit is one of our beginning efforts to provide some guidance to not only individuals, but our chapters and our leadership. And we also, over the past year, since actually late spring, we've been working with some consultants who've been working with us and our board and some committees within NATS. And we've been going about very purposeful conversations and very purposeful actions to make sure that the tools that we provide our members and others in our community to better address some of the DEI issues, but also to create a more inclusive and equitable community within NATS are resulting. These have been going on all this fall. We've had several meetings. One of the products that's going to be coming out of that is a series of training modules that all leadership within NATS will be required to complete, but they will be open to anyone who wants to use the materials in those modules to broaden their understanding and understand how we as an organization are working to create a more diverse and more inclusive environment within NATS. We've had some great conversations. We've begun identifying, pain points, identifying issues that have been systemic, but also issues that we know that we want to change in positive ways, in ways that serve the diversity of students that we have, as well as the diversity of members that we have, and also create an environment to ensure that we're welcoming all people and all types of teachers to our organization. It's a process, and it's something that's going to take time, but I want everybody to know that our president, Carol Blankenship, and our entire board and executive committee have been committed to this process. We may not always see all the things that are going on behind the scenes to get to some of the final products we're working on, but I'm very pleased and I'm very excited about the conversations we've been having, the work that's going on, the leadership of our consultants, and how they're leading us to create some new products and also work through a variety of things in our organization, whether it's ensuring the types of representation we want on committees and boards and chapter boards, region committees, and our national committees as well, and ensuring that our panelists in our workshops, our national conference, represent the full spectrum of our membership and our community in the performing arts, and particularly among singers and teachers of singing. And some of our chapters have already taken the DEI Toolkit and had some wonderful discussions among themselves, and are already taking action within their chapters based on some of the ideas that are presented in the toolkit. So I encourage you to read it and let it sit, go read it again. Just let it seep into your mind and your heart, and see what kinds of conversations you have at the local levels in your chapters or in your regions around what's in the toolkit and how you can ensure and work toward making sure the opportunities are available at all levels within NATS. The Chicago chapter is working on a project now relative to being able to make all their student auditions free so that there's not an access issue and there's not the economic barrier, which is, we know is a barrier for certain individuals. And in the Boston chapter, they've done some really wonderful work during the pandemic. They had a wonderful multi-event conversation called Table for More, and it's also archived on their website, on the Boston Nats website. So I know Kayla's here tonight, so I'm sure she'll be happy to pop in and talk about it more if we have time later. But their chapter has gotten really serious about a multiple aspects of diversity inclusion. They've been working hard with partnering with a community organization that provides lessons for students in the community, but also is full of teachers who have not been NATS members. And so they've been partnering with that organization to not only bring in those teachers, but also partner actively to help fundraise and help support the work that that organization does. So there are many ways in which we will live out our work in DEI with NATS, and there will be some things that are nationally applicable. There are things but to me, the most important work that will happen in DEI really is at the local level and in the chapter level. And when we begin to see the right conversations happening, the right openness to ensuring that equity and inclusion is really woven into the fabric of every activity that a chapter does. It's woven into its leadership. And as we see that happen, then the impact will be magnified in the work that we're doing. I'm really excited about some of the work Nathan and Lily and Albert are doing, because some of the things they're doing at their institutions are things that are really going to impact, at least in higher education, for generations to come. They're going to have great impact, and I'm really excited that there are NATS members this engaged with in the higher education community, and also I'm excited because I know that these three individuals in particular, and many other people who have been a part of our conversations so far, are so passionate about the independent teacher in our organization and how we can have a really wonderful impact for the students who come through our independent teachers, and how we can reach them even earlier, how the conversations that we were just talking about having in our college level studios can change in the future if our independent studio teachers are equipped and understand how to also use some of this work in their studios to have these begin to develop these young students at an even younger age, and to develop their awareness and help them self-realize their worth and their individuality and the voice that they have to bring to the singing world. I'm going to stop there because we have many more things to talk about, but I do want everyone to know how committed NATS is to these conversations, and that you'll be seeing a lot more conversation and a lot more individual action out of some of these conversations.
Thank you, Alan, so much for that. So let's talk about some of the topics within the DEI and the field of voice teaching. Historically, we have operated from a Eurocentric perspective. There remains kind of an implicit hierarchy common in academic settings, placing classical music above all else and making American popular music the other. So let's start the conversation there. Nathan, would you like to begin?
Yes, I think one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do within my own studio is to just address that issue straight on, with allowing students to really explore music that is meaningful to them. from whatever heritage or whatever community they come from. And then on our voice faculty, we've allowed students to really exemplify great singing from whichever perspective they feel most comfortable showing that. We have many students who are coming to ASU because of sort of the silos that usually exist between musical theater and opera and popular music styles. Those silos don't exist at ASU. And so in a jury setting, we're able to judge all of the standards that we hold high in terms of the musical standards that we hold high. We are able to judge that no matter what style of music that they are singing and presenting in the jury. And so it relieves a lot of pressure for those students. And just the idea of sort of working with the students. I know personally in my own studio, I've had students who have decided to say, I'd like to focus on folk songs only, or I'd like to focus on particular languages that don't exist in sort of the big four, right? And so that's a really great opportunity for us to just change the way we see and assess students in their technical ability, in their technical development, in their musical and professional development, also to prepare them and to make them aware of the opportunities that exist after the academic experience that may or may not include the Eurocentric sort of model of music. And so I think that's a great place for all of us to start. I know that we were talking about before, I think it was in the green room, as we put it, Kari, we were talking about sort of not necessarily, Albert was saying, not to lower the expectations as we're looking to invite and to expand the opportunities for students, but to allow them to find and identify and adhere to higher expectations within whatever style of music that they decide to pursue. And that is really important to me as a classical music professional, but also growing up in the church and growing up singing jazz and other styles of popular music. I find value in all of it, and I try to communicate that to my students. And it's a space where, particularly on our campus, and I imagine it's also the same on campuses across the country, where people are starting to see that you can teach proper breathing technique, proper vocal production, and healthy vocal engagement without necessarily using the classical model as the rule. And so I think that just using the students as sort of the vehicle to explore those different styles of music, I've allowed myself to also be a student in that respect, because we have international students as well. So sometimes they are wanting to do music in languages that I don't personally sing or that I've never sung in, such as Chinese or Korean or Samoan. And that's a very interesting perspective to show up into the studio, and knowing that I can teach them how to sing and guide them in terms of how they use their breath, but maybe they have to teach me how the diction works, or they have to teach me how the style works. And that really creates, I really enjoy this concept of adding the B to the DEI, the belonging component. It really helps to bolster that idea of belonging when the student has this feeling of authority in the room, that they come to the space being able to sort of teach me something as well as learn something.
Albert, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that, Nathan, that's pretty phenomenal what you just shared. I want to add to it that just sort of a cautionary tale. I think sometimes in our busy studio work, where there's never enough time to do everything that we know we need to get done, and there's a tendency sometimes to go with this model of, well, what does the student want? What does the student want? And I think we have to be very, very careful, because oftentimes students want what they know. And the point of study is to expand our horizons beyond what we know and what we've experienced. And so it's where developing curriculum becomes so important, that there be room for a student to have a piece, among their list of repertoire for a given time period, that speaks to them personally, maybe a style that is off the beaten path, maybe a language, something to that effect. But we have to make sure that we are challenging not only our students, but challenging ourselves to break out of our barriers. To that, we've got to also be mindful of how we speak about different songs. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a teacher here in Connecticut, and she was in a professional development. And one of her colleagues said, you know, these students don't listen, you know, they only hear good music when they're with us. And my friend sort of commented back and said, well, who determined that the music was good and that the music wasn't? And so we've got to be really careful about our own biases and our own ideas of what musical genres and what musical styles are supreme, because that stuff will creep into our language and it will creep into our action. And then when we are accused of being biased, all of a sudden our collective fragility is touched, you know, in a way that we feel thrown. But that's where the rubber meets the road. It's when the language and the action actually come together to show us who we really are, and to also be able to connect to our students in a way that is transformative.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Lily.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I love this conversation because so often we talk about our students and their identity and this idea of intersectionality, or the idea that we all hold multiple identities, some marginalized, some dominant, and some not. And I think about that as it pertains to music as well. So my doctoral dissertation was on the art song of Latina composers in the United States. And it was a discussion of how we are entering a new era as Americans where some music will be intersectional just as we are intersectional. So this music that is being written by Latin American women who identify as Americans, citizens of the United States, with a heritage from Latin America, that music is American music and it's also Latin American music. And a piece of music can be two things at the same time, and we can be comfortable with that. And I see that in the repertoire people choose, and how genre has started to become intersectional as well. Because if we look at the history of Latin American music here in the United States and how it got here, a lot of the music that we would consider contemporary music or pop music can also be sung in a classical style. And so I always urge people to have an arsenal of music at every pedagogical level from these particular heritages that you can offer to students and say, this is probably music that you've heard before. It's, you know, for example, the bolero is a really important type of music in Hispanic culture, Latinx culture. It came to the United States in the 60s, and everyone knows that music now is popular music. But there are covers by Plácido Domingo and Juan Diego Flores. And so this music can also be used as art song. And so not being afraid to understand that as Americans, some of our music is art song and it's also popular music at the same time, and that is okay. And the other thing with that is if you are looking to expand your palette of music, that way we're not all assigning music from the Anthology of Spanish Song, which is a wonderful resource from Hal Leonard. But again, we're looking at heritage of our students or the music that we want to represent. That book is mostly music from Spain. And I'm assuming that most of your students will have Latin American roots. And so what does that look like in difference of diction, in terms of style, in terms of dance rhythms that they may be used to, tonalities that they're used to hearing, things like that. And then there are women in that book. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's called Romance Boleros Favoritos. It's a really, none of the music is difficult, but it's a really good crossover or beginning into Spanish art song that is uniquely Latin American and not from Spain or having heritages in Europe. And there are women composers in there. Bésame Mucho, which a lot of people know that song. It's by Consuelo Vázquez, the woman composer. You can knock out multiple identities by picking out some of, some of this music celebrates specific people who have been hiding in plain sight. And we just shy away from teaching that music because we think, well, that's not really art song though, is it? It was on the radio, my grandparents listened to it, they danced to it, so it can't have any inherent cultural value if it's not a European art song, but it does. And we have to be comfortable with the idea that sometimes music is intersectional as well, and just because it's not a European Spanish language art song with poetry from a 17th century Spanish poet. There's more art song than that. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Because as Nathan was talking, I thought, oh goodness, in a quarter system that I was at the university, we're barely getting recitals put together, of the classical repertoire, since the program there is based on classical repertoire. And so how do we have time to also then introduce them to other genres? Not only, if we're going to introduce other genres, we also need to understand the cultural context. That's something that's really being talked about right now in our community. I'm so grateful for that. It's not okay just to give a song without understanding its context. But I think what Lily said, and Albert as well, it leaves room within the classical canon to still make these inclusions. I don't know if anybody wants to address that a little bit.
Kari, I think one of the things that we have to grapple with as teachers is that ultimately we always make time for what's important. And so we have to make the decision that this is important, and we have to make time for it. I would say what Lily just shared opens up such a wonderful sort of segue into something that Nats, I think, has done a brilliant job of, and has long been an important part of American musical heritage, and that's the history of the spiritual. And understanding that the spiritual, in the way that we often hear it in the Hall Johnson the category, and now with the American Negro spiritual category, that at its purest form, anthropologist and author Zora Neale Hurston actually criticizes these concert spirituals as inauthentic from the vantage point of an anthropologist. And so I think it's really important to have a really broad understanding and not just seek to, in a sense, colonize other people's music into the classical style. And we want to understand, and you as a teacher should also want to understand what the origins of this music, what the origins are, and that understanding is brought to bear so that you understand that you're doing something that is pulled from a culture and fused with another culture to create something new.
May I break in for just a second? There's a question that's in the chat.
Yes,
that talks about the framework for universal assessment, regardless of style. And I think what you were talking about, Albert, is exactly kind of leading into that. Essentially, many people were sort of having an issue with how do they assess, say, the popular music or CCM, as it was called at one point, in various chapters, et cetera. And we often deal with that in the university setting, to where maybe classically trained voice teachers are having to listen to and assess somehow, popular music presentations, and trying to figure out how to do that without sort of trying to squeeze a popular music singer or a singer who's singing that music into the classical style and sort of viewing those vocalizations from a classical lens. I think it's very important for us to spend some time sort of understanding, as you mentioned, Kari, the context from which it's coming, and understanding that not all vocalizations are the same. And different cultures have different ways of vocalizing their folk music or popular music within that style. And so it takes a bit of learning and education for us as the adjudicators, as the teachers, to lead and guide students through that. And my framework, particularly for me personally, is that I'm looking for vocal freedom. I'm looking for freedom and authenticity, because that's the thing that allows for a student to have longevity in whichever direction they decide to professionally use their voices. So if it's going to be an R&B style, I'm looking for as much freedom that accompanies the authenticity of that style as possible. So if I'm looking for some assessing a singer singing gospel music or opera, I'm going to be looking for the authenticity and the expectations within that style, and the freedom within that voice. I hope that's clear enough for some people. Yeah.
So I think we can even go, Nathan. I'm glad you went back to that question. I think we can go just to sort of maybe qualify that understanding a little further, we have to move beyond the subjective, I think, and into the elements of vocalization that are more objective if we want universal assessment. And so, you know, there are multiple ways of taking a breath and supporting the flow of air in any given style. The question becomes, has the student developed some level of mastery over how they breathe and how they use their breath? There are multiple ways of getting healthy quality adduction of the folds. Is the student actually doing it in a way that's healthy, that's consistent? There are multiple ways to articulate text. Is the student doing that? So it really is taking the constituent elements of singing and actually adjudicating that and not adjudicating sound. Because we all have a sound. Some people like brighter voices, some people like darker, some people like loud, some people like light. And so in that regard, we have to move beyond the sound that we like and actually watch. And I try to use my eyes more as a teacher to balance out the biases that my ears may have. So that we get a healthier and a fairer assessment of singing. And then there's that intangible piece that is just art making, and are you able to move your audience? Are you able to move us with what you have to say? And so those kinds of things, I think, get us to what the questioner says is sort of more universal assessment and away from a not just Eurocentric, but a classically supremacist thinking and how we adjudicate singers.
Man, this is really good.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, Nathan, I think also maybe a little bit behind that question is, how long has it taken the faculty in the voice area there to move into, you know, a broader understanding and be able to assess students in a more holistic way, such as you described?
Yeah, I think it has to do with lots of conversation and slowly opening up the pathway to assessment and opening up the pathway for the students. Albert was talking about, you know, basically if we give students at the early age of their development the choice, they will choose the thing that they're most comfortable with, right? They won't choose to be challenged in most cases. Some students will, but most students won't. And so we do have to maintain the position of challenger somehow for the student and to expand their experience. That's why they come to school. But essentially what we do is we try to guide them in a way that allows them to understand exactly what Albert was saying, is that there is a fundamental way of using your air. There's a fundamental way of supporting the breath and getting sound out that can be turned in any which direction you want. I'm looking at another question that just kind of appeared, and this is a really interesting one. It says, do you think that there are some styles of singing that are contrary to healthy singing? And thinking in specifically in terms of throaty singing. Now, I have many examples of particularly gospel singers, but I tend to put mariachi, gospel, and opera in the same category in my head because it's all very visceral type of singing. And I know of many gospel singers who have sort of used what we would call the squall or the growl or this kind of, you know, quote unquote throaty type of singing and have maintained a career over 30, 40, 50 years. And so the concept of you will break your voice, you will ruin your voice, that kind of thing is sort of dispelled by the fact that those individuals and many like them who are, you know, don't appear in necessarily the canon have done and are doing still. There is a way to engage the body that does not necessarily ruin the voice or harm the voice. And I think that yeah, go ahead.
No, so I was in answering that question, do you think there are some styles of singing that are contrary to healthy singing? I want to answer that question really specifically and say no. And I think that the real answer to that question is there are unhealthy ways to sing every style. And I think, you know, we have adjudicated vocal competitions for years and years, and we have heard classical singers sing very unhealthily. And we've heard it for years. And so we don't want to presuppose health with a particular genre. You know, I'm thinking over the course of the summer, I was listening to Jasmine Sullivan's Tiny Desk concert, and I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and I said I was mesmerized listening, because I said I can actually hear everything she is doing in her throat. Like, I could hear what was happening. But she's been able to maintain that over a long career, and she did it over the course of that entire performance without issue. And I sort of said to myself, this goes back to back in the day when I was studying with Stephen Smith, this realization that the instrument is actually in the throat. And so we have to grapple with the fact that what we mean by throaty singing is somehow the musculature being constricted. That's a whole different way. So we have to, again, it's about how we use words that mean something to us, but that communicates something different to a person that has not been acclimatized in the way that we may have been in the voice world over the last 40 or 50 years.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you both. Lily, did you want to jump in with anything here?
Yeah, I think I would just ask another follow-up question to that question and say, what is the desired outcome of the person who is singing? And especially when we're talking about other historically, genres of other cultures, what is the point of the singing? And is vocal longevity really the goal? Because sometimes, I mean, for me, singers, we're communicators, we're storytellers. We want to tell a story. And if someone wants to make a sound that may not be particularly healthy, but is essential to the way that they tell their story, I don't have a problem with it, as long as they understand why they're doing it and the context of which they feel that that is necessary in that particular music. So I would just, again, because Nathan brought up the idea of mariachi, a lot of that music can be sung unhealthily. But again, what is the intent of you singing that music? Do you understand the historical context? Do you understand why we do a grito? Do you understand how to do the grito? And just the idea that sometimes we make sound to communicate, not because we want it to be healthy or beautiful, because again, that's imposing this European standard of bel canto, of beautiful singing, of the outcome of the singing should be an aurally pleasing tone. Not necessarily. I mean, even if we look at our music theater genre today and how that's evolved in the United States, it's not always about making, I tell my students all the time, it's not about making beautiful sound and having everyone awe at the beauty of your instrument. It's about you telling the story and having those other people feel where you're coming from. And so I would just ask that follow-up question of, do we have to make beautiful sound all the time? And is it okay to sometimes make sound that isn't necessarily healthy? I would say yes.
And Lily, in the middle of what you were saying, Rachel Velarde says, and then that presupposes that we know how the perceived sound is being produced. I'm thinking specifically at studies of nasality and perception versus sound coming through the nose. Even experienced singing teachers can be profoundly inaccurate in understanding the how of the vocal production. And as you're all talking, part of me, on behalf of many independent teachers or teachers that are classically trained and haven't opened up to the numerous other styles of music, it can be really overwhelming for teachers. We are supposed to be now superior, to have superior knowledge in anatomy, physiology, acoustics, cognition, motor learning theory, vocal health, styles, genres, right? Cultural context, repertoire, not to mention all the list of musical theory, etc. So I guess what I want to know from you brilliant panelists is, where would one, if there is specific genres or specific styles of music that they want to become familiar with, where do they start in addition to understanding the pedagogy and all the other obligations?
Well, I'll say Nats has this wonderful book series called So You Want to Sing, and there's 20 volumes in it, and there are a lot of styles represented there. That's a great place to start if you're looking for just a resource on some specific, it's not all inclusive, but it was an effort by a variety of authors to bring some expertise to the field and find a way to supplement both students who want to sing and are motivated to sing a variety of styles, and teachers who want to supplement their education to date with some of that material that they can use in their studios.
Thank you, Alan. I teed that up for you really nicely, didn't I? That was not intentional, actually. Lily, would you, I'm going to turn corners just a minute because I want to get this in. We had it as part of the description of tonight about brave spaces. And I think throughout the conversation tonight, that has been implicit. But could you talk a little bit about this idea and how this works in this context?
I think that when we look at a marginalized identity that we are not part of, we get nervous to say the wrong thing. And then again, this idea of like the intent versus the impact of why you're engaged in this work. Are you engaged in this work because you don't want to get canceled, or because you don't want to be seen as old-fashioned? Or are you actually interested in this work because you legitimately have this need or this desire to get this information? Because all of this information is constantly evolving and changing. You can't just come to this Nats chat and you're woke and you're done and you've got your certificate of authenticity. You have to keep up with the language and the way things change, and constantly be in the work. During the Boston Nats chat, we talked about the difference between being an ally, which is passive, and an accomplice, which is active. And so this idea of, we're not creating safe spaces as voice studios. We're not creating this environment where all of us are afraid to engage with one another and learn from each other. It's a brave space. It's a space where intent will be assumed to be good, and you can learn and ask the questions that you need to ask so that you can understand or get that information from someone who's willing to give it to you, which is why it's so important. The other question that I get a lot is, I'm white, why should I be engaged in this work? Just like in a choir, when we all have to stagger sing and stagger breathe, people are going to get tired of being engaged in this work, especially if it directly impacts them and their lived experience. And that is why we need those accomplices who can pick up where they left off and do the work when other people get tired. And so I just think it's really important to remember that, and to not be afraid, because in the United States, we have this very odd tradition of not speaking about race as though it's something impolite to discuss. And that has done us a disservice as people, because now we don't know how to talk to each other without getting defensive or without worrying that we will be seen as a bad person, which is why I love the idea of having a brave space where you can have this kind of laboratory environment and talk to people who don't come from the same experience as you, and ask questions and share, and seek to understand, not seek to master, because none of us will ever master this material. We're all imperfect human beings. We could all be canceled at any point because we're all just trying. And so I would urge you, if you are from a majority group and you're hesitant to talk about this with people, put yourself out there, because that's where the learning is. And we don't learn by remaining in our safe space. We learn in our brave space.
That's so sorry, go ahead.
No, I was thinking as we were talking about this before we started the chat, and before we started the chat, and even now, this idea of brave spaces, I was remembering my own time in my previous position and working with a very diverse voice area, and I had to recognize that the lifelong effect of being an American and being specifically a Black American was that I had an understanding that I always had to be at my best, that I had to follow the rules within the letter of the law. And if I was going to move ahead, there were no shortcuts for me, because I wasn't going to get a pass if I made a mistake. And what I realized was that what I brought to my teaching of that is when I was teaching specifically Black students, and to a large degree also specifically Latinx Spanish-speaking students, that there was a perception that I was harder on them. And I actually, when I realized what I was doing and when I realized where it was coming from, I actually sat the entire studio down and I said, these are the principles that I teach. These are the things that I want you all to know. These are the things that I believe as a professional singer you need to know to move forward, specifically around vocal function, also around music learning, around fundamental music skill. And I said to them in that moment, I said, I have been guilty of preparing you for the world that I know is out there. I have been guilty of preparing you for the world that I experience even now. And it's a world that is unforgiving of Black and brown people who make mistakes. And it was a time of intense healing for me and a time of intense understanding for my students, who all of a sudden saw me be vulnerable and me grapple with my own internalized anti-Blackness. And I would venture to say that if I have that kind of internal struggle around how I was treating certain groups of students, it is quite possible that someone who doesn't share this identity also has that same struggle. And I think we have to, and maybe the struggle expresses itself differently. Maybe you don't find yourself being harder on them, on certain students, but maybe you find yourself not investing in the same way. And so I think we really as teachers have to be really honest with ourselves and stop and refrain from coming up with answers to difficult questions that make us feel good, and find the answers that are the actual truth. Because the truth doesn't always feel good, but the truth will move us in a direction of freedom. And that's personal freedom, that's vocal freedom, that's expressive freedom. And that's where we all want to live, I think.
Thank you. Alan, did you?
Yeah, I like we've moved our discussion a little bit into ideas of function, rather than this and that and the other. And I think that idea of promoting, the function of the voice in the various modes in which we use it to express a variety of feelings, a variety of texts, a variety of styles is so important. And I also want to kind of, a lot of things that we try to change about our profession in the various settings in which we operate, some of us in the academic world, some of us in the independent studio world. It takes so many, we have to come at it from so many different ways. And I really want to speak a little bit to the independent studio teachers, because I think you have the greatest freedom of all, because as an independent studio owner and teacher, you can shape, lives in the ways that are just amazing. And you don't have to worry about talking to your colleagues in the department, in the academic setting, navigating some of the politics that engenders and brings about, and the collection of issues that are institutions. And yet, while institutions are trying to make positive gains in so many places, I think some of the greatest power is that if our independent studio teachers continue to, because many of them are, keep the reins and keep the pressure on and keep moving on these issues in your independent studios, that then the students come to the institution with a whole different set of expectations. And that in and of itself will put an immense pressure on the institutions that are today serving our students. And so it takes pressure from lots of different sides to continue to move forward in the continuum in the ways that we want to celebrate the diversity of our profession and ensure that students in the future are able to express their gifts in authentic ways and ways that they want, that they choose, and not be put into any kind of box with that, but that they can mold and shape their own, future in that way. So I really encourage, our independent studio teachers. I've seen some of the great things that some of them have been doing, and I celebrate that. And I just say keep doing that, because you must realize that it will put pressure on the academic side of things to change when students enter the door expecting something different and understanding that they have how to advocate for that change.
I think, Alan, to your point, I think we have to grow in a really short period of time. We have to grow very quickly and grow in ways that for many of us may be uncomfortable, because this idea, we've been talking in the chat as well. There's been several comments about vocal freedom and vocal function. And I think we have to be really careful about reducing discussions to one point or reducing discussions to one thing, because ultimately that term freedom starts to mean very different things to very different people. And the idea of freedom of speech has been used to shut down protest. The idea of academic freedom has been used to shut down progress. And so I'm very leery of terms. Well, it's all about freedom, because we understand that these words can be weaponized in different ways to mean different things. Well, one of the things that we have to do is recognize that some institutions are going to prioritize certain genres and styles over others, and those institutions are well within their right to go in that direction. Here at the Yale School of Music, the School of Music is decidedly classical in the work that it does. It doesn't stop us from doing that work in a way that, or studying that genre in a way that is as equitable and as inclusive as possible. And so we just have to be really, really nimble and not look for short, quick answers, because there are none on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Albert. That's great. I realize we're at the top of the hour, but I don't want to leave this esteemed panel without a couple quick more things. One not so quick, actually. And Nathan, are you going to depart us?
Yes, really quickly, but I can stay until about 10 after the hour.
Okay, we've got 6 minutes, so I'll ask for you to lead the answer to this. And then if you have any other final thoughts for us, I want to ask this question about, let me find it here. Oh goodness, where did I lose that to? It's essentially about white fragility. I want us to talk about that, and implicit bias, and what is needed in the voice studio to change this.
Well, for me personally, I feel like the biggest component to changing the implicit bias is to have more exposure, more guided exposure. And what I'd like to lead with is empathy. The first thing is to sort of understand where someone is coming from in order to really listen to them and to accept what they have to bring to the table, as opposed to immediately judging it based on our own experiences. Because I think that when we understand where someone else is coming from and what someone else brings to the table, we have an opportunity to really make a more informed decision, informed by the sensitivities and the context that they're coming from, as opposed to only imposing our own, if that makes much sense.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nathan. Anything else before? I'll come to Albert and Lily to answer that question as well. But Nathan, before you depart, is there anything else with regards to the broad topic that we're here to discuss tonight that you'd like to say?
Well, I would like to say that, I would like to encourage all of the teachers and anyone who's listening who's involved in the profession of singing or teaching singing, that you continue to move forward with an open mind, continue to move forward with the willingness to have the conversation. One of the things that Lily mentioned, and I think it may have been mentioned several times here, is that sometimes when people are uncomfortable, they shut down and they don't want to have conversations about things that make them uneasy. They want to just kind of stay in the place where it's safe, you know. And I think that in all of our institutions, there was also someone in the chat that mentioned, you know, the independent teachers, sort of echoing what Alan has mentioned. The independent teachers who are outside of the academic structure have a great amount of power to help influence what's happening in academia and how we support students who come through those channels, mainly because they are not restrained by, you know, the moving towards tenure or any of those other elements. They really get an opportunity to explore creativity in the way that they address all of these issues. And so I would just say that if there is an opportunity for the independent teachers to encourage more independent teachers to join NATS, to be a part of this conversation so that we can find creative solutions to the way that we manage the academic space, so that we create the equity that is so challenging to achieve.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Albert and Lily, would either of you like to address this topic of white fragility, implicit bias in the voice studio?
Sure, I'll let Albert be the finale. So in the chat, I'm going to put another resource for everyone. I hope everyone likes to read. It's called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of Privilege. It's by Peggy McIntosh. This is an introductory article into understanding what unconscious bias is and understanding when we have privilege that we cannot see. The point of having the privilege is that you cannot see it. And so a common argument that I hear often is, well, I grew up poor, so I'm also marginalized, even though I'm still white, or things like that. So the conversation that we're really having today is what things are still barriers for our students that we didn't have, that we don't even realize that were not barriers to us in the first place. One example that I can think of really quickly is that often opera performances are scheduled to be Friday nights. Well, I was in a cast with someone who is Seventh-day Adventist. She needs to go to church on Friday nights. No one thought to ask her what days she would like to perform, because it was assumed that all of us are Christian and go to church on Sunday mornings. And so again, that's just one instance of something that you assume to be a universal trait of all people, because it is a trait of your culture, that may not be held by other people. And so just constant asking questions, constant learning, constantly trying to glean information from other cultures that you may not be familiar with. The other thing that I hear often is, well, I live in a really homogenized area, you know, rural Iowa or what have you, and I don't have a lot of opportunity to interact with people who come from different places with me. Okay, well, you have access to media, you have access to other music. I mean, all the things that you have access to online, on YouTube. Look things up, read books. I don't think that the burden or the impetus of sharing cultural dialogue should be on the people who are from the minority population. There should be an interest from the majority group in finding out these things from the more minority groups, and having an interest that it has an intention of wanting to understand, instead of, again, what I said earlier, wanting to master. Because we're not here to master something and say that we're perfect. We're just here to continue learning and finding more ways to tell more stories.
Thank you, Lily. Albert, do you want to bring us on home?
Sure. I guess I'd love to end by putting this out to everyone, is that we are a part of a large community, and that large community is called humanity. And within that community, there are smaller communities that group themselves in all sorts of ways. And we sometimes move fluidly through those communities. In the United States of America, there is a history, there are documented instances of injustice and and horror, for lack of a better way of saying it. And part of this moment that we're in is recognizing that history, grappling with how that history shapes where we are right now, and doing the necessary work in our communities to both heal from the past and then uproot the tentacles and the foundations of biased and inhumane treatment against other, in order to create a larger community that is that recognizes everyone as inherently valuable simply for being human. We cannot do that without recognizing that there is a structure that is at play in our country. There's a structure that's at play in our organization. There's a structure that's in play in our universities and our institutions. And there's even structures in play in our independent studios. There's structures of thinking. There are structures of action. And at every turn, we have to look at it and see, is this providing the most equitable opportunity for everyone who is coming to this table to dine? And as much as that may make some people uncomfortable because the way it has always been done has served them, we are trying to move on to a new moment where we're not just serving the majority, where we're not just serving some, where we're not just serving the most well-connected, the most well-financed, but we're attempting to serve anyone who wants to sing. And from that vantage point, we have to change. And that work of change is not an overnight process. It's not a one-time training. It is a daily grappling with all of the ways in which our thinking has been shaped, our practices have been formed, and making sure that ultimately our collective highest and best is at the forefront of our minds when we're leading large organizations that have an effect on large groups of people.
Thank you. My goodness, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I as we finish here, I just want to encourage everybody, every voice teacher, academic and independent, to include a statement of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, so that it is on your website or in your syllabus or anywhere it can be seen, so that we continue to keep that at the forefront of what we are doing. And I just, I want to thank Lily, I'm sorry Nathan had to leave, and Albert for your incredible contribution tonight. Your words and the way you articulate these ideas is really powerful, so thank you. Thank you so much. And to everyone, please join us for the last NATS Chat of 2021. We'll have more, of course, in 2022. We're going to jump into the snake pit of voice pedagogy and talk about registration with Jan Svech and Christian Erbst. They're two incredible articles in the Journal of Singing. I encourage you to read both of those before the chat in December. And John Nix will be joining me as co-host. So I hope to see all of you then, and have a lovely Thanksgiving before then. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Good night.